Om Jnanatimirandhasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapada Kamalam Shri Guru Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakham Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Namo Mahavadanyaya Krishna Prema Pradayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tushe Namaha Vanchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, Hare Krishna again. I'm very sorry about running a hint late. Today we will be resuming off where we left off last week, which was just wrapping up chapter 7, right? So we had finished chapter 7 and we were about to enter into chapter 8, but because I think my incessant coughing, I sort of timed the class a little off. I didn't factor that in and we didn't get to the activity that I had planned, which actually works out better because I think the activity I had planned works out better for beginning chapter 8. So I'll just share my screen to go right to the beginning of chapter 8, or rather right to the ending of chapter 7. Let me share my screen. So how far did everyone get? Has everyone read into chapter 8 yet? Yep, we're all on top of it. Jai. So when we go and take a look at chapter 7, we'll see that right at the end, Krishna, he starts discussing some certain topics, especially in 29 and in 30, right? Because what does he speak about? He speaks about, well, those who are in full consciousness of him. Again, we're speaking about devotion, but he also starts mentioning things like Brahma, Adhyatmam, right? Sadibhut Adhidhaivam, right? We're hearing about all of these sort of words. And if you go through the word for word, these are all relatively complex ones. The Bhagavad-gītā is famous. It's well known for having rather simple Sanskrit. They say after a year of Sanskrit, you should be able to read the Gita rather straightforwardly. And that's been my personal experience. If you do an introduction to Sanskrit, you'll be able to understand 70% of what you're reading. You'll have a pretty high level of cognizance. But yet here we're finding relatively complex terms that we don't otherwise hear. Again, adhiyagyam, right? So Krishna, he is mentioning all of these different terms and he's bringing them up for the first time. As much as I inundate all of you with Sanskrit terminology, I don't think any of us recognize these terms, do we? Right? These are all rather new terms. And even in general practice, in Krishna consciousness, when we're attending the temple and all, we don't often hear adhiyagyam, right? We don't often hear that word being used. So these are all relatively technical terms. And this is how Krishna has concluded the 7th chapter. However, then, when we come to the 8th chapter, Arjuna is going to ask a very natural question. And it's a question that I'm sure we can all relate to. Whenever we have all of this new terminology and everything getting dropped, Arjuna rather straightforwardly simply asks. And what does he ask? I'll say the Sanskrit and maybe Divyansh Prabhu can say the English. Arjuna uvacha kim tad brahma kim adhyatmam kim karma purushottama adibhutam cha kim proktam Adhidaivam kimuchyate. Divyansh Prabhu, are you there?
Yes, Haribo.
Yeah. Okay. All good.
Arjuna inquired, O my Lord, O Supreme Person, what is Brahman? What is the self? What are fruitive activities? What is this material manifestation? And what are the demigods? Please explain this to me. Thank you.
Jai. So we see Arjuna has had this very appropriate, this very relatable experience, right? He's heard all of these words. He's heard all of this terminology. He has no idea what it means. And so he's very naturally asking. I'm going to stop my share because we're going to break into the activity now. It's not a too fun one, but it will be very relevant for us to be able to process these things. So I'm going to break everyone into, how many people do we have? Yeah, we nearly have a full class. So let's go. I'll break it into 3 groups. We'll have 3 groups. And in each group, what I'd like you to do is to isolate within the first 5 texts, texts 1 to 5, isolate each thing that Arjuna is asking, and then also isolate each one of the responses. So how does Krishna answer them? Because Krishna actually defines these terms very rapidly, very quickly. We might not have picked up on it while we were reading. We tend not to. That's why I want everyone to actively study it so that they can get the flow of this 8th chapter. Okay, so far so good. So we'll break into 3 groups. In each one, just break down the questions and the answers. So isolate each one of the questions that Arjuna has asked, and then find a spot where Krishna answers each one of the questions within the first 5 shlokas. Okay, I'll create the groups. Oh, wait one second. We have a few late stragglers. I'll just add them in and then I will make the groups. Okay. Okay, I'll see you on the other side. If you have any questions, please let me know. Okay, Hare Krishna. So, I hope that all went pretty straightforward. How many questions did we all find? Let's have maybe Shrikanta Sena Prabhu, your group. How many questions did you find?
We got up to basically 7.
7, okay. Jai, how did everyone else's group go?
8.
8, Jai. 8, okay. So Shrikanta Sena Prabhu, are you able to share the screen? Do you want to write out your 7? Or who scribed? Who was the scribe of your group?
Divyansh Prabhu.
Divyansh Prabhu, would you like to share your screen? I'm pretty sure I've set it so that
it's incomplete. We just got up to like
all good. Just let me know if it lets you screen share.
Yeah,
it should. I've changed the settings. Do your 7 and then we'll see what the 8th one is that everyone else found.
I only wrote down 5.
Oh, hurry. Well, that's all right. Then we can find the other 3.
All right. So can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's the first question. What is Brahman? So Brahman is the indestructible, transcendental living entity which lives within us. That is the Brahman. And what is the self, if somebody else wants to elaborate?
Yeah, I'll elaborate. Thanks. So that first answer was found in text 3, and same with question 2, which is what is Adhyatma? What is the self? Is found in text 3, and the word is used as Swabhava, which is essentially the nature of the self, which basically come as part of the jiva. What does Adi mean? Mrugank's asking.
Give me a second. I'm not sure off the top of my head. I think it's just a, yeah, I'm not sure.
It's not original. The word adhi is not original. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Let's keep going with this.
There's yeah, we also had Katyani Mataji and Srinivas Prabhu. You can do the next one.
So the third one we find is about the karma, like the work or the fruitive activities. So the activities that generates the material body and generates the material body for the living entities. So that is about the third point.
Fourth one is Adi Bhuta, which is the material manifestation, and it is constantly changing the physical world.
Yeah.
And then we're moving into that point number 4. Question number 5 is about the
Adi
Daiva, which is representing the demigod, universal form of the Supreme Lord.
Yeah, Jai, the universal form, which of course is a material form.
Yes, it is
yeah.
like material conception of the Supreme Lord.
Yeah, 100%, and it includes all the demigods and their planets. Which
planets, correct.
Coming back to the previous chapter, as we were discussing, what is the nature of the demigods? What is the nature of them? Why can they grant things? They are simply like the body parts of the universal form. And that's why Srila Prabhupada says, it's foolish to think that we can worship whichever one and get any result. Because you cannot put food, if you put food in your nostril, you will suffocate, right?
Yeah.
So you need to use the appropriate parts of the body, right? And Krishna is the central stomach, right? Which is powering everything. You need to make sure the food gets to the stomach, okay?
Like it says in Yathataror Mula Nisechanena. So when you do the when you water the roots of the tree, it will nourish the entire plant, something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, then who's next? Which other group? I can't remember your groupings. Who was in which group? I think Mrigang Prabhu, your group. What did you have for after that? After those first 5, what did you find?
So we realized that 6 and 7 are answered in sort of one phrase by Krishna. So the Lord of Sacrifice is Krishna, and how does he live is as the super soul in the heart. And then how can those engaged in devotional service know Krishna? It's by remembering Krishna alone at the time of death. So I forgot to put the time of death, but I just thought it was in the question, so I didn't write it down.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So we've got the complete thing there. So that's all of the questions. So Krishna has got some clarification for Arjuna. We'll go through the text now individually, but I just wanted to break that down because I always find when there's rapid questions and rapid answers, we tend to gloss over and we don't see how each one is lining it up. And we don't see the specific nuances because there are specific nuances. Okay, let's open up chapter 8.
Hare Krishna Prabhu.
Yeah.
Oh, can you please clarify, or maybe we are going to do them in detail in verses anyways, maybe
That's all right. What is it?
Prabhu, there's a bit of confusion between Adi Brahma and Adi Bhutam.
Between Brahma and Adi Bhuta?
Yes, Brahma and Adi Bhutam.
Brahma is referring to the jiva. So, and Adi Bhuta is referring to the material world. What is the, I'm not sure where the confusion is.
Oh, I thought it is the Brahman, so not the Jiva part. Okay, Prabhu, maybe that's where I got confused. You know how there's a Brahma and there's a Brahman?
Yeah, no, it's not 4-headed Brahma. No, that would be a little bit confusing. I would be confused as well. But no, not the 4-headed Brahma, Brahman. Okay. And Brahman can refer to various things, can refer to the Brahman effulgence, can also refer to the jivas. It's a little bit confusing like that. Again, with Sanskrit, with Krishna consciousness in general, we get we get in the mindset that these words have rigid meanings, right? We get in the mindset that these words, they mean this one thing and they can never mean anything else. But no language is like that. Do any of us know any language that's like that, right? The classic example is bark, right? When a dog barks, he's doing something very different than the bark on the tree, right? The tree is not barking in the same way that the dog is, right? So we find words have semantic range, to use the technical term, right? They have a range of meanings. Yeah. Yes. Okay. I'm going to ignore the Brahma as the supreme personality of Godhead stuff. I'm sure we can all refute that by now in our Bhakti-śāstrī study. Okay. So I will share my screen. So Arjuna, he has asked these questions. And as we can see, actually, I'll turn the word for word on just so we can see. So his questions are, what is the Brahma, right? Adhyatman, what is the self, right? What are fruitive activities? What is the material manifestation? And what are the demigods, right? And so the reason why this is asked is, well, he's asking why, what is the Brahman, right? Because earlier, as we've just had our confusion, and as we've already just had our confusion demonstrated, Arjuna is having the same confusion. What do you mean by the Brahman? Do you mean the Jiva? Do you mean Paramatma, right? Because what do we know? We might all remember this famous saying. Prabhupada mentions it in the purport, I think. Oh, no, he doesn't. I thought he did. But we might know this very famous saying. Who has heard of it before? Aham Brahmasmi, right? Many of us will have heard of this before. I am Brahman. Yes, everyone is God, right? That's how people like to render it, right? However, Aham Brahmasmi doesn't mean anything more than I am of a spiritual nature, right? Because again, if we want to be very strict, if we want to be very narrow with our ways of defining words, then we might have this sort of conception. But we don't. And as we'll find again, Krishna is refuting Mayavad throughout this text, because how does he define Brahman then in the third text? The indestructible transcendental living entity is called Brahman, right? So this is how we understand what it is. Anyways, now returning back to the question. So Arjuna, he has this issue. What is the Brahman? Is it Paramatma? Is it the super soul? Or is it the individual Jiva, right? And therefore, Krishna, he is about to clarify that. Now the remaining question is, what is Adhyatma, right? What is the true nature of the self, right? Is it that which is expressed in the gross body? Or is it that which is expressed in the subtle body? Please clarify this for me, Krishna, okay? So I might annotate that on, right? Adhyatma, gross or subtle. Then we hear what is karma, right? The karma that's being discussed, is this karma fruitive or spiritual activity, right? So he's asking, what is the nature of karma? This karma you are discussing, is this material or is this spiritual activity, right? We're having similar questions. Now, asking questions like this, they are not to be considered questions that are silly to ask, right? Definitional questions are the most important. Bhakti-vidya Purna Maharaj, before he does his Bhakti-śāstrī, and his Bhakti-śāstrī is studied full time. So they do around, I think, 5 sessions a week, and they take 3 years to do the whole thing. They study each Shastra twice, and then they do extra Shastras, which help supplement their understandings of those main Shastras. So just feel happy you're just feel happy we're doing this one, okay? Next time you feel like I'm setting too many readings, just be happy we're not doing Bhagavad-gītā 2 times. Once he goes through all the verses in order, and then he goes through a second time and he thematically links all of the verses, right? So yeah, next time you get upset about the readings I said, just feel happy you're not in Mayapur, or rather maybe feel sad you're not in Mayapur doing that level of study, okay? Unfortunately, with our time constraints, we can't do anything like that. Anyways, but before he starts his Bhakti-śāstrī, what he'll do is he'll have everyone sit down and he'll have 8 sessions where all they do is define the terms he's using. Because then there's no issue, right? We have so many communication issues. Even now, I'm sure, even in our 3rd module of Bhagavad-gītā, people will still be saying, in this shlok, does this word mean this or does it mean this, right? So what Arjuna is doing, he's doing something very sensible. He's trying to get cognizance. He's trying to get an understanding. Exactly what are you referring to, Krishna, when you are making these final points, right? Because now that Krishna is speaking about the highest conclusion, now that he's speaking about the absolute conclusion, which is, what is the theme of these middle chapters? What are these 6 chapters about that we are studying in module 2?
Bhakti.
Bhakti, devotion, right? Now that we are discussing bhakti, we need to be very clear about what we mean, because these are very essential topics, right? So Arjuna, he is trying to get these defined. Then next, adhibhuta, right? What are you referring to with the adhibhuta, right? What is the nature of these things, right? Are they pots? Are they bodies of the living beings? Are they rivers? What is material nature, right? It is subtle nature part of that, right? I mean, of course, we already know the answer. Subtle nature is material, but that's not immediately apparent, right? It's not immediately obvious that our minds are material. We can be very tempted to think that our minds are spiritual, right? Because we don't see them, right? We don't see our minds, and therefore we will think, I mean, we do see our minds. In fact, everything that we see is our mind. The world that we see right now, I'm seeing a laptop in front of me. You are all seeing a digital representation of me. That's not actually the material world. You are seeing the impression the material world makes on your mind. So actually all you are seeing is your mind. But because because it's like a TV, right? You see the image on the TV, you can almost forget the TV is there. You know, when you're there and you're watching a movie and you get really engrossed in the movie, and you almost will forget that there's actually a projector projecting the image, right? You're totally absorbed in the image. It's the same with the mind. We get so absorbed in the image that our mind creates, we forget that we are watching the mind and we think we are directly seeing the world. So because of that, it is not clear what exactly the material nature is and what it isn't. Then, of course, we have Adhidaiva. We've already had this discussion of the demigods. Who are the demigods? What are the demigods? This is a natural question which comes up. Krishna, he said, those who are foolish, their minds get stolen by worship of the demigods. But what does it actually mean for something to be a demigod? What is the true nature of the demigod, right? Of the demigod or the demigods? Okay. And then to answer your question, Mrigang Prabhu, I had it written down in my notes. I just totally forgotten. Adhi means the greatest as compared to Adi, right? So Adhi means the greatest. And therefore, when we hear Adhyatma, he's saying, what is the ultimate identity, right? When he's saying Adhibhuta, what is he's saying, what is the ultimate, nature of things? What is the ultimate nature of the material world, right? When he talks about Adhidaiva, he's saying who is the greatest what is the greatness of the demigods? What is the fullness of the demigods? Does that make sense? So he's not just asking what are the demigods, but he's also asking what is the fullness of the demigods. And that's why it's a Virat Rupa. Because we might wonder in Krishna's answer, why is he bringing up the Virat Rupa? Why is he bringing up the universal form? If this is meaningless to you, by the way, in the 11th chapter, we will hear much more about the Virat Rupa. So he's asking, who is that which presides over the demigods, right? What is the fullness of the demigods? And again, the demigods are in their fullness when they're in the body, right? The hand is best understood when we speak about it in terms of the body. And in the same way, the demigods are best understood when we understand them in the fullness of the material manifestation. So what is the supreme demigod? Okay, Then we come on to the next set of questions. Let me see if let me scroll down. It won't. Okay. So mouse. So then we come to text 2. And in text 2, we find the same thing, right? So we find adhiyagya, right? So again, we are using the term adhi now, right? So we're not just asking what is the nature of sacrifice. That is why Prabhupada renders it, who is the Lord of sacrifice, right? Because adhi has this implication, again, of above or over. So above or over or supreme. In the same way, we can understand who is that which is above or over, who is that which is supreme, who is that which is ruling over yajna, okay? I'm sorry, I know you all didn't sign up for a Sanskrit lesson, but that's what we're getting today. So who is that who is ruling over the yajna? And that is why Prabhupada says, who is the Lord of sacrifice? I'm going to write a note anyways, but Prabhupada's already really given that. Who is the Lord of sacrifice? Who are the sacrifices being done for? Again, we've talked about yajna, we've talked about what is sacrificed. Again, it was a point I was stressing when we were doing the first module. The first module is theology of man. It is theology of the person. It is theology of mankind. It's talking about what is the person. And that's why we're talking about Nishkama Karma Yoga. We're talking about the Gyanis. We're talking about all of these things. What we were discussing is what is the nature of the person. And therefore, when we discussed yajnas, what did we discuss? Mainly, we discussed what does the person give up? How does the person perform yajna? These middle chapters now, we are discussing theology of God. We are discussing theology of Krishna. We are understanding Krishna. We are understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And we're understanding how everything we've really learned in the first 6 modules can relate to Krishna. Again, that's why, remember I said the beginning of chapter 4 is like the hint of these middle chapters, because that's one of the only times Krishna started discussing himself. Now we're really opening ourselves up to a discussion of Krishna himself. And that's why we've learned about yajnas in terms of what humans provide. Now we are learning about who is the recipient of all yajnas. Does that make sense? So then we go on after Adhi Yajna. What do we hear? We hear, how is Adhi Yajna known in the body? Okay. So this is what we could say an additional question. As Mrigang Prabhu indicated, it's actually secondary. That's why if you got 7 questions, you weren't really wrong, right? Because this really follows on. In many ways, this question of how is the Adhi Yajna known is really question 7.5. So that's why I asked how many questions you all got, because I was curious how you all divided that. Both ways are fine. Really just depends how your mind goes. Right? And this is part of it, right? So how can this person be known, right? And then finally, we have the main question, actually. And what is the main question? Who can tell me?
How to get saved?
Yes, how to get saved, to put it very simply, right? How can one know you at the time of death, right? How can one remember Krishna at the time of death? And I wish I had the opportunity to make this bold. I'm a bit of a boomer with technology, so I don't think I can, but I'll put it in all capitals. How to know Krishna at time of death. Because this question is what we're basically going to spend the whole chapter discussing, okay? As we've already discussed, Krishna quickly and rapidly goes through and answers all of these other questions in the next 2 shlokas. Then in chapter 5, he begins discussing it, and he basically doesn't stop until the end of the chapter, okay? And much like chapter 4, I'm not going to give you guys a real breakdown of the structure of this chapter, because in my personal opinion, it's a chapter that just really flows like there's one big point that's being made. Some people will break it down and you'll see different devotees break it down, and I have no issue. If you prefer to study that way, I'm sure most of you have Surrender Unto Me or Gita Subodhini. If you don't, please, get a copy, because they will have a breaking down of it. But in my opinion, the texts 1 to 4 are the questions and the initial answers, and then 5 to the rest of the chapter is just Krishna elaborating on this point. Okay, so I'm not going to do the standard breaking down of the chapter because I really think it's just two things. Arjuna puts forward the questions and Krishna just answers them. Personally, I think you lose the flow of this chapter if you try and break it down too much, because it's a very flowing, Krishna is just leading on from one point to the next point to the next point to the next point. If you disagree with that, feel free to bring up your own structure which you think works better than just a free-flowing one. Control B, who knows? Let's no bold would do. So these are the these are the questions that have been asked. We will go over the answers quickly, besides this final one, and then we'll have our break. And then for the remainder of today, we will discuss how to know Krishna at the time of death and how that ties in to a lot of broader questions. You might think that one chapter is a lot of time to spend on simply one question, but this question ties into a lot. A, why is this important? B, how can this be affected? And C, how do I actually achieve this? Now, one thing that I quickly want to discuss before I get onto the answers is it's a well-known thing. What happens if we remember Krishna at the time of death? Who can tell me?
You get
You go back to Godhead.
Yeah, two people spoke at once, but I'm sure you all said the same thing. You go back home, back to Godhead, right? If you remember Krishna at time of death. And I know a classic thing, growing up as a devotee, or growing up as trying to be a devotee, I had the thought that I'm sure many other kids have growing up as a devotee, or maybe not even just kids, is that, look, I'm just going to do whatever, not going to follow regular principles, just going to do whatever I want. And the moment I'm going to start dying, the moment I'm going to get sick, I'm going to remember Krishna. I'm just going to really think of Krishna, and then it doesn't matter what I've done, right? That's a classic little thought. I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had it. If I am the only one who's had it, I've outed myself as a complete materialist deep in mind, right? But this is a question that I'd always think, whatever, I'll have garlic bread and, brownies with eggs in them or whatever nonsense, right? But then the moment I'm about to pass away, I'll just remember Krishna and then I'll be set. Krishna discusses in this chapter why, as cool as an approach as that sounds, it's not really too feasible, okay? So it's a very relevant question. There's lots of subtle other aspects that have to do with this question. Okay, so let's go to Krishna's answers before I continue outing myself as a severe materialist. Those kids have never been in an airplane. Oh, trust me. Even before I decided to start taking Krishna consciousness more seriously, the moment bad turbulence happened, I was deep in remembrance of Krishna. Yeah. Okay, so text 2. Okay, so then now Krishna, he begins to start responding, okay? And he begins to start defining these things, right? So what do we hear at the beginning? What is Brahman, right? The indestructible, transcendental living entity is called Brahman, right? So Prabhupada here, this is the purport I was thinking about when I said earlier, I think Prabhupada says something, that there is Brahman and there is Para-Brahman, okay? Brahman is the living entity and Para-Brahman refers to the spiritual personality of Godhead, okay? So this is why it can sometimes get confusing. And this is where Srila Prabhupada has explicitly referred to the definitions, okay? What is confusing is we'll find throughout the Gita, the word Brahman is used to refer to the two. But just because the same word is used to refer to the two doesn't mean they're the same. And this is where Prabhupada, he's drawing out this distinction, okay? So technically, when we speak about Brahman, the word Brahman really just means spiritual. If you want to be very literary. When we're being technical, it means much more. But just as the general vibe of the word, it means something which is transcendental. And as we discussed in chapter 7, right? Of the two energies, who's been memorizing their shlokas? Who's been memorizing their shlokas? There's two energies. There's a superior one and there's an inferior one. Who can tell me? Which shloka is that? Which shloka am I referring to? Ooh, nobody's learned their lesson from last module of shloka memorization. Which shloka am I referring to when there's a superior one and there's an inferior one? Apareyam, yes. Okay, we've got that. Is anyone brave enough to recite it? Okay, I saw Tarun Prabhu mute himself the moment I said that, so I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, please practice your shlokas now. For your sake, not for mine. It doesn't hurt me, but just so it's less stress for all of you. Okay, so we've heard there's a superior energy and there's an inferior energy, right? And the jivas are the superior one because they animate the inferior material energy, okay? So the jivas do have this spiritual position, but they are not as spiritual as the para Brahman, right? Parampara means one after the other, right? And so para has this indication of something which is beyond, which is above. And so the para Brahman is the supreme Brahman, okay? The supreme spiritual thinger, okay? Of course, Brahman has very technical meanings, but this is a more intuitive way of grasping the meaning. Now, what do we have as the next question, as the next answer, right? His eternal nature is Adhyatma, the self, okay? So Srila Prabhupada in the purport, he very nicely says that the nature of the living entity is to do what? The nature of the Brahman is to serve the Para-Brahman, okay? We see Srila Prabhupada, he writes this somewhere or another in here, right? The nature of the Brahman, or the nature of the Adhyatma, it's not the material body, it's not the subtle body. It is the very jiva itself, okay? It is the very thing. But what is that nature? That nature is to serve, right? So Adhyatma, gross or subtle, I just realized I've misspelled subtle. It's neither. What it is the soul itself, because the soul itself has identity. Sometimes we speak and we think of the soul as just being this very passive thing because of the way we speak about things, right? Prakrite kriyamanani, right? We speak about that and we think, oh, the soul is doing nothing. The soul is just watching. The soul is very dynamic. It does have an inherent nature. And in fact, the nature of our subtle body and our gross body is an expression of that nature within the soul, okay? The soul itself has an inherent nature. And what is that inherent nature? It is to serve. It is to serve and it is to desire. And when that nature gets expressed, that desire gets expressed in interaction with the material world, then our gross body gets born, then our subtle bodies get born. Our bodies are merely the expression of the desire of our soul, and that is the adhyatmic nature. And that's why Srila Prabhupada, he writes that the adhyatma, he starts talking about material bondage, right? He talks about identification with either the material or the spiritual nature. You either get a material body or a spiritual body. Either one is an expression of that desire, but either it can be expressed in relation with the Para-Brahman, or it can be expressed in rejection of the Para-Brahman. Does this make sense so far? And then the last that is defined here, action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities is called karma, or fruitive activities. What is the difference in jiva and atma? Are they both the same? Yes, they're synonymous. In general, we tend to use the word jiva to refer to embodied living entities, and atma to refer to the thing separated. That's something I've noticed in terms of general use, but technically there's no difference and you can use them both in the same way, okay? So yeah, they're synonymous. They have slightly different flavors of meaning, but I wouldn't be too strict about those different flavors. Does that make sense? But yeah, they're both basically the same thing. Yeah, you can say Brahmavadis use it to differentiate. Even our acharyas slightly will use it to differentiate, Remember Bhanu Maharaj, he was once giving a class and going into the nuances of this. But basically, yeah, Jivatma. That's a very good resolution. Let's all just say Jivatma to never confuse ourselves. But basically they're synonymous. Like you can use them interchangeably. Don't get too hung up on the two words. Again, there's a different flavor and you'll sort of pick that up intuitively the more you read Prabhupada's books, but they're two flavors of the same concept. Jai. Jai, okay. Okay. And then last we've heard, what is the definition of karma? And this is a point I really want to stress, okay? Action pertaining to the development of the material bodies of the living entities is called karma, or fruitive activities, okay? This is very, very specific because often, well, what is it? When somebody, you know, an Australian says, oh, that's just your karma, mate, right? When they say that, what do they mean, right? They mean, oh, what goes around comes around, right? They mean something like that. But Krishna is defining karma as something much, much deeper, something much, much more specific, okay? And what do we hear here? Karma is that which develops the material body. And this ties into what we've already discussed, okay? What we've already discussed is, so bodybuilding and getting huge is karma, absolutely. That's how I spiritualize my my gaining lots of kilos during lockdown, is I'm saying bodybuilding is 100% for materialists. I'm very spiritual, and that's why I don't go to the gym. But actually, that's technically true. Bhakti-Vikas Maharaj, he gave a class about this, how to get very big muscles like me. I'll send it into the WhatsApp group. It's a really, really cool class. He starts chastising bodybuilders. It's really, really nice. Okay. Jai. Okay, so got distracted. So, but it's tying into what we've already discussed here, okay? So what is the nature of the jiva? The jiva desires, okay? And then the jiva desires, but the jiva also serves. It is the nature of the jiva to act and to serve and to desire. If you want to go on a long tangent, there's other natures of the Atma. To identify is also one of them. And Prabhupada's hinting towards this. Jiva Goswami gives a long list of all of the key of what is the adhyatma of the jiva. Again, if this was Bhakti-śāstrī Honors Edition, we'd go all through it. But the two basic ones in terms of what we want to understand here is that they desire and they act. So when the jiva desires, right, and it desires materially, it then begins to act those desires out. And by acting those out, it requires a body. And therefore it creates a body. And therefore to continue satisfying that, it'll continue making karmic activities in order to construct bodies. People will hear karma and they will think it's unfair, right? They'll say this system's unfair because I don't remember what I did, right? How is this justice? And it's because we're almost trying to put like a Christian or a Muslim, like an Abrahamic idea of justice onto our conception. When we speak about karma, we're not talking about the divine justice system. We're talking about a simple cause and effect. The jiva desires this and therefore Krishna gives it. And therefore it is fair because it's simply reciprocating the desires and the wishes of the jiva. And that is why karma is that which constructs the body, right? Because the body is the fulfillment of the desires of the jiva, right? And that's why we're so full of desires that we wish to use our bodies with, right? The body, and again, not to repeat the content from last week, but that's what I was discussing. All the jivas, when Brahma creates the material universe, all the jivas are there in Brahma. That's why there's the effulgence coming out, the glow which comes out from Brahma. And this time, Taran Prabhu, I do mean forehead of Brahma. The glow which is coming out is all of the jivas incarnated within him, because all those desires need to be there in order to manifest all of this material existence, okay? So we shouldn't think of it as some sort of justice. I mean, we can, and Prabhupada does refer to it as a justice system, and it does work like that. But on a deeper level, it's a cause and effect. You desire this, you do this, and therefore you get it. And therefore, what is karma? Karma is the activity which constructs the material body. Shrikanta Sena Prabhu, you have a question, and then we'll have a break. I thought I'd be able to do the next book before 11:05.
So Prabhu, like my main question has to do with like, Arjuna's questions itself. I mean, if we were to stop the Bhagavad-gītā after chapter 7, I mean, he would have all the answers already. Why is he asking these questions? And is it a cop out of, oh, is it to help all of us souls?
It's a bit of everything. So one thing, Arjuna, and I can't remember where, but there's actually a point where Arjuna already changes his mind, and it's not at the end of the Bhagavad-gītā. Arjuna changes his mind midway through the Gita. I need to remember where. One of our acharyas comments at this line, you know, Arjuna is now convinced, right? So it's very explicit. It's definitely the cop-out, right? There's definitely an aspect of the cop-out. And I don't think it's too much of a cop-out, because why is the whole reason Arjuna is acting this pastime out in the first place? It's so the Bhagavad-gītā can be spoken, right? But also, it's being spoken because Arjuna wants to hear about bhakti. Arjuna wants to hear about Krishna, right? So even after Arjuna has his mind convinced, even after Arjuna has his mind changed, he still wants to hear about Krishna. Devotees don't just, devotees don't just think, okay, I've learned enough, now I'm going to go. We always want to hear Krishna's pastimes, right? I always think of my spiritual master. I remember seeing a video. He was reading Srimad Bhagavatam with his brother. And together they were relishing Srimad Bhagavatam. They were both laughing, right? They were both laughing and relishing the pastime. And I was thinking, how many times, Guru Maharaj has read, since a small child, Guru Maharaj has been studying Srimad Bhagavatam, right? Guru Maharaj was once saying, I heard from one of my godbrothers that Guru Maharaj used to sneak out, skip school and hang out with his friends, and they would read Srimad Bhagavatam together, right? That's what they would do, right? So deeply he's been studying Srimad Bhagavatam, and still he's laughing and relishing it, right? So as devotees, we always, there's nothing that's old for us, right? Krishna is ever fresh. And so we want to hear these things again and again and again. So Arjuna, he's relishing this. So Arjuna is both being selfless and having this high knowledge of the Bhagavad-gītā being told for everyone. And he's also being very selfish in the way that devotees are selfish, in that we can't stop hearing about Krishna.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, Alex, is the metaverse, the metaverse is the next level of Maya, right? Yeah, this is the metaverse. Now we're doing a metaverse within the metaverse, where we think we're bodies that we're not, and now we're thinking that we are bodies of bodies that we're not. I don't know how to do it, but it's my exception. Okay, let's do a 5-minute break quickly so we can come back and get through this chapter. I'll see you all at, let's do 11:14. Okay, Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Okay, so yes, today is very philosophical, so I I apologize, but I'm excited to do chapter 11 with everyone. I just put it that way. It'll be interesting. I'm still not sure how I'm going to teach it because it's such a visual chapter. Okay, so now we go on to the next section, which is answering the final set of questions, which is, what is adhibhuta, right? What is adhibhuta, right? So the physical nature, which is constantly changing, is called adhibhuta. Now again, adhi, what is the ultimate nature of it? Yes, the ultimate nature is, as we can infer, prakriti, right? However, what is really interesting is, what does Srila Prabhupada use, or rather, what does Krishna use in order to refer to it? Ksharaha, right? Constantly changing. So when, again, to come to Mrigang Prabhu's question, when we speak about adhi, we're speaking about the ultimate or the supreme nature of something. And so what is that ultimate consideration of the material manifestation? It's that it is inherently constantly changing. Interestingly, let's contrast that against the jiva, which is aksharam, right? And here we find that the material nature is ksharaha. The words are slightly related, and they're sort of going in opposite directions. So ksharaha means that it's constantly changing, because what is the inherent nature of everything that is material? It's that it's here today, gone tomorrow, right? So yes, it is prakriti, and yes, matter is eternal. Matter has never been created, nor is it ever destroyed. right? Which I think is the current understanding of physics as well, but I might be wrong. Again, I'm doing an arts degree for a reason. But my understanding is that physics also holds to this idea that matter is never destroyed. And we also hold to this idea. However, what we do hold is that everything that is done with matter eventually goes. Matter is constantly changing, right? I don't know if any of you studied Ozymandias in high school. Did any of you do that poem? Has anyone done it? No? Ozymandias is a great poem, which I think illustrates this point beautifully. It's one of the real masterpieces of the English language. And it speaks about, I won't recite the whole poem, although I still have it memorized because I enjoyed it a lot. And it begins with the poet speaking about how a person from a distant land came and spoke to him and described to him this beautiful, majestic statue, which is completely broken apart in the desert, right? And when he sees the statue, right, he sees that the statue is completely broken. All that you can see is the head in the sand and the arm sticking out of the sand. But the only thing that really, really remains is where the feet were. There was a pedestal. And on that pedestal, these words appear: "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair," right? So the pedestal says, look at all the great things I've done. This is meant to be a pharaoh. Ozymandias is the name of one of the pharaohs, right? And he says, look at all the mighty things I've done and be afraid, right? And how does the poem finish? Immediately after that, it says, nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. So the whole idea is, he says, look upon my works, be so afraid, look how great I am. And the poet says, all that remains are lone and level sands. Just sand surrounds this pedestal, right? This is the nature of the material world. Here today, gone tomorrow. Even the greatest kings. One of my majors is biblical studies. And it blows my mind because whenever we do the history of all of these things, every 100 years, the great kingdom is some kingdom that most of us don't even know today. Who here knows of Babylon? Babylon in its time was greater than America is today, right? But it was there yesterday and it's gone today, right? Virtually every kingdom we discuss no longer exists anymore. Even if you go back a few hundred years, we talk about things like, let's look at Germany, right? The country of Germany is only a few hundred years old. And yet we think about these things as these strong, stable things, right? But nations, items, everything, it all just goes away, right? That's why often devotees will sometimes get disturbed when they'll hear about archaeological findings and how they relate to the Vedas, which is all very well and good to read into those things if you want. But what they don't realize is we only have like 2 or 3 things. Our ability to go back with the archaeological record goes back a few thousand years maybe. Why? Because it was here today and it's gone tomorrow, right? The material world is inherently changing. It's just a bunch of sand, right? It's a desert. And sometimes we'll build a sandcastle and become very proud of it. But only a few years later, it fades away. This is the nature of the material world. And so Krishna, he is stressing here. What is the nature of the physical nature? What is its ultimate status? It is ksharaha, constantly changing. Okay, so then we go to the next question. Adhidaiva, right? Adhidaiva. What is the nature of, or rather, what is the supreme? What is the leader? What is the greatest of the demigods? And Krishna here, he clarifies that it is the universal form of the Lord. Again, we're reiterating the point that was made earlier about how the demigods all are parts of Krishna's body, which is the material world. And he's making here a point, right? That, that it's not Indra, it's nothing else. It is the universal form, okay? And then I'll just go right on to the next point, which is the Adhiyagya. What is the Adhiyagya? It is the super soul in the heart of every living being, right? Krishna is the ultimate recipient of all sacrifices, okay? And what is the point that's being made? I've mentioned these 2 together because I wanted to just be so very clear that Krishna is making the point that if you perform sacrifices, or if you worship the demigods, or even if you worship the continuously changing material manifestation, ultimately, the only person who can truly receive worship is Krishna, right? Because all of these things fade away. All of these things fade away. The demigods are simply composed of ksharaha, right? Of that constantly changing adhibhutam, right? So ultimately, Krishna, he is the shelter of all things, because Krishna is akshara. Krishna is unchanged, is eternal, unchanging, right? So Krishna is making the point, no matter what other things are there, all of these things are temporary, and ultimately I am the source and reservoir of all of them, right? And therefore, who is the Lord of sacrifice but Krishna, right? So if no matter how we do this, ultimately Krishna, he is that ultimate recipient of all sacrifices. However, and now we come to the remainder of the chapter. However, if we truly wish to go beyond this, right? If we truly wish to go beyond this understanding, then we should meditate on Krishna, right? If we want to go beyond all of these three, if we want to go, because all of these three, again, all of these things, not these three, all of these two, rather, all of these two, they are all within the material nature. So if we want to stay within the material nature, what is the name of this chapter? Who can tell me what the name of this chapter is?
Attaining the Supreme.
Attaining the Supreme, right? If we are trying to stay within the world of the demigods and of the material nature, are we attaining the Supreme? No. What we are attaining, again, apparayam, let's really retain and internalize the shloka, okay? We are attaining something that is even below us. We are supreme to that which we are attaining. And how then can we be happy, right? But this chapter is about attaining the Supreme. And if we wish to attain the Supreme, then we should meditate upon the Supreme, right? And how do we do that? Maybe we can have, who should I ask? Ruchika Mataji, would you like to read out the English after I say the Sanskrit? Antakale cha mameva smaran muktva kalevaram yah prayati samadbhavam yati nastyatra samshayaha.
And whoever at the end of his life quits his body, remembering me alone, at once attains my nature. Of this there is no doubt.
Jai, right? Thank you. So Krishna, he's discussed the nature of all of these worlds, right? He's discussed all of these details. He's discussed how everything is temporary. He's discussed what Brahman is. He's discussed all of these things. And now he's answered the final question, which is the most important question. Meditate on those things and you will attain them, right? What was the first half? Karma is that which gives us our material bodies, because it's our longing, our meditation on that is which is material. But meditate on Krishna, and then we will desire Krishna. And if we desire Krishna, then at the end of one's life, quitting the body, one attains the eternal abode of Krishna, right? This is clarified further in text 6. Maybe we can have Shri Mataji, would you like to read out the English after I say the Sanskrit?
Yeah.
Yam yam vapi smaran bhavam tyajyante kalevaram tam tam evaiti kaunteya sada tad bhava bhavitaha.
Whatever state of being one remembers when he quits his body, O son of Kunti, that state he will attain without fail.
Yeah. So these two together, I think, go very, very well in terms of elaborating this principle, right? Remembrance of Krishna is essential. And why is it essential? Okay, it's not just a get out of jail free card. It's not just something which people say in order to, oh wow, Krishna is amazing. It makes perfect sense in terms of the philosophy as we've been discussing it this whole time through, right? Because what we desire is what we get. Right? This is such an essential principle in order to understand that the world, what the universe is. It reciprocates our desire, right? And so when our desire becomes Krishna, then naturally we will go to Krishna. Krishna is so merciful that because we want to be in this material world, we are. Sometimes we think, oh, how terrible is it? How terrible is Krishna that we have to be in this material world? But actually it's the opposite. How merciful is Krishna that he will give us whatever we want. Now, it's the fact that we must remember why we say back to God rather than forward to God. And I'll come to that question later on, but that's a very Alex question. So I feel like I'll mull over it while I'm speaking the rest of it, and then I'll sort of think about it. But I definitely will. If I don't come back to it, please remind me, okay? Krishna is very merciful, right? Krishna is simply saying, what you want is what I'll give. Now, when we want the impossible, which is to rule over the material world and enjoy it and be the masters of it and everything, Krishna, he just says, okay, I'll give it to you, right? But we can't really blame Krishna. That is our desire that's manifesting the body. That's our karma that's continuing to manifest it. Krishna is merciful to let us exist in this material world, right? But Krishna is even more merciful in that he very easily lets us desire to exist in his eternal abode, where there is much less suffering, where there is much less issue, right? So, therefore, we now come to the thing I mentioned earlier, which is, of course, the classic, well, I can just remember Krishna. Why am I chanting 16 rounds, right? Why am I trying to follow the regular principles? Why am I doing this and that? Why am I going to festivals, right? I don't need to say why. Nobody says, why am I honoring prasada? Interestingly enough, it's always the why am I chanting 16 rounds? Nobody's really complaining about having to honor prasada, okay? So, why are we doing all of these things? Srila Prabhupada, he answers this in the purport. Who can tell me, in which part of the purport is he answering this? And also the chat has gone wild, so maybe I will answer Alex's question since everyone's going off in it. But before we do that, I just want to make this point. Maharaj Bharat, right? Maharaj Bharat is given as the example, right? Although a great personality thought of a deer at the end of his life, and so in his next life, he was transferred into the body of a deer, right? Okay, so what is the point? When you are dying, it is not so easy to just think of something, right? Now, most of us can't remember how we died in our last birth, okay? That's not something that and thankfully, Tamal Krishna Goswami says it is a mercy because it is such a difficult experience. Krishna is again merciful, he lets us forget it, right? But when one goes through the dying process, it is not very easy to keep one's faculties with themselves, right? This is not very easy. So we say, oh, it's easy, I'll just think about it. But actually what we see is that when one begins to pass away, one thinks of what they are accustomed to thinking of, one thinks of what gives them comfort, right? And if that's been the material nature your whole life, you're not going to think of Krishna in your final moments, right? So this text, I think it's almost not even saying, just think of Krishna when you're dying. What it's saying is think of Krishna always, and then you will naturally think of Krishna when you die. Does that make sense? Because the example is given of Maharaj Bharat, who was on the platform of Bhava even, right? And he thought of something else, and therefore he became a deer, right? So there actually is no cop-out. Srila Prabhupada, he says this in a few classes. He says it is not so easy to remember Krishna at the time of death. It is not so easy. We are in the habit of remembering quite literally everything else. And therefore we are doing Krishna consciousness. Therefore we are practicing bhakti yoga so that we can be deeper and deeper in remembrance of Krishna. And therefore we come to the next text. I'm just going to say the English so that I can keep flowing with my point. Therefore, Arjuna, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna and at the same time carry out your prescribed duty of fighting. With your activities dedicated to me and your mind and intelligence fixed on me, you will attain me without doubt, right? With your activities dedicated to me, then you will attain me without doubt. Why? Because if you think it's difficult to remember Krishna while you're doing your activities, while you're doing your duty, how much more difficult is it to remember Krishna at the time of death, right? We think, oh, it's hard to remember Krishna while I'm even washing the pots in the temple. Well, then how do you think it's going to be like? Srila Prabhupada, they're very raw when you hear these classes. Prabhupada talks about in his final pastimes, in his Antya Leela, he talks about the difficulties of the dying process, right? You'll hear Prabhupada, he'll discuss it. It's very difficult, it's very painful, it's not nice, right? A very heavy topic. I'm sorry to ruin your Sunday morning with something as heavy as this. But again, it's related to what we're discussing. Prabhupada, you can listen. If I have time, I'll try find one. I'll send it into the WhatsApp group. Prabhupada starts discussing, it's not a very comfortable position, what I'm in now, right? And so we think when we're healthy and just going on and doing our activities, we struggle to remember Krishna, then how much harder is it going to be to remember Krishna at the time of death when we are not healthy and when it is all very difficult? So this is the point that Krishna is making. We must always be in remembrance of Krishna. And therefore, when we do our services, sometimes people think it's enough to just do the services, right? I can wash the pots, but I can think about my work, I can do another service, but I can gossip about the other devotees, right? I can do another service, but I can, I can think about the next episode of whatever TV show I'm binging, right? We can do all of these things, right? But this is not the essence, right? You'll get some benefit from it, but you will not get Krishna consciousness from it. What does Krishna say? Therefore, Arjuna, you should always think of me in the form of Krishna and at the same time carry out your prescribed duty. We'll remove our fighting for most of us, okay? We'll just end it there, right? You must do both of these things. Remembrance of Krishna is essential. His Holiness Gaur Govinda Maharaj would ask his disciples, how often are you Krishna conscious? And they would say, Gurudev, we're brahmacharis, so right? Everything we're doing is service to Krishna. And Gaur Govinda Maharaj would say, yes, but how often are you relishing Krishna's form? How often are you thinking how sweet is that little blue boy playing his flute? How often are you thinking how wonderful is it that Mother Jashoda is tying up the supreme absolute truth? How often are you relishing that beautiful Krishna is dancing on the heads of Kaliya? How often are you meditating upon this? And they all said, Gurudev, maybe during Srimad Bhagavatam class, maybe just then. Gaur Govinda Maharaj would say, until then, you are not Krishna conscious. So, not to be heavy, but it is what it is, right? We are meant to be in remembrance of Krishna, right? When we are doing all these services, we are purely, when Mother Jashoda, when she is churning the butter, right? When she's churning it, right? Churning the ghee, sorry. When she's churning it, right? What is she thinking of? What is she doing? What does Srimad Bhagavatam describe her doing? She is singing songs about Krishna and she is remembering Krishna. This is Krishna consciousness. Srila Prabhupada will say, Krishna consciousness is not so cheap. On the one hand, it's very easy. Chant and be happy, go Ranga, let's all dance in the kirtan. And 100% that is Krishna consciousness. But Krishna consciousness is also remembering that sweet little Shyam Sundar boy when we are washing the pots. Krishna consciousness is very paradoxical. It's both very, very easy and very, very difficult, right? But the beauty of it is the difficult stuff is very, very fun to attain, right? So we have a very fun time attaining these high levels, right? And such attraction can only come organically, right? It's not a forced thing. It's not that you should force yourself to think of Krishna, but simply by growing in our study of Shastra, simply by growing deeper in our performance of Kirtan, that was a joke. Simply by going in our meditation of the holy name, simply by doing all of these things, we will naturally grow more and more attracted to Krishna. And attraction to Krishna is not something abstract. It's not something like, oh, I'm feeling more and more attached to Krishna because, he is the Supreme Personality of God. We grow more attached to Krishna simply because he is beautiful, right? And the more and more we can relish this, the more and more natural Krishna consciousness will come to us. His Grace Keshavananda Prabhu, who's He's a disciple of His Holiness Bhakti-Vikas-Swami, and I think he's probably one of the only disciples of Bhakti-Vikas-Swami who's more intense than Bhakti-Vikas-Swami himself. I've seen him give classes where he was asking a shloka, one of the Bhakti-śāstrī shlokas, and nobody could answer it. And he said, how many of you have studied Bhakti-śāstrī before? And half of them raised their hand. And he said, you should all return your certificates. It was a waste of your time. So he's very, very heavy, right? Very intense. But because of that, he's also very nice. But he says, right? He says that the best way to improve our chanting, the best way to improve our japa is to read Krishna book, right? Why? Because then we can become infatuated with this beautiful Krishna, with this sweet Krishna, right? Krishna consciousness is not something forced. We're not here to beat our minds into submission and say, why aren't you thinking about Krishna, and get all mentally unhealthy. Krishna consciousness is to naturally think of Krishna because he's so beautiful. And that's why we have I told you all the story of the adulterous woman running in the middle of the night? I've already said the story, haven't I? Yeah, we have that story, right? The adulterous woman, she's running and she knocks over the impersonalist yogi who's meditating, and he gets broken out of his meditation. And the next morning, that impersonalist yogi, he meets that woman and he says, why did you bump into me? And she says, I didn't even realize I bumped into you. And then he realizes, with that level of attachment, she's meditated so strongly, she didn't even realize she bumped into me. But I got fully disturbed in my meditation. Krishna, by his beauty, draws out the mind in ways that discipline never will. So we should not be harsh with ourselves and try to discipline and beat our minds into thinking about Krishna. Instead, we should simply relish Krishna more and more. And the more and more we grow to appreciate how beautiful and sweet Krishna is, simply like that, naturally, we will be Krishna conscious. And then at the time of death, naturally, we will think of Krishna. So then, and that's why, what does Srila Prabhupada write? Therefore, the chanting of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, is the best process for successfully changing one's state at being at the end of one's life. So these texts are often very much taken out of context. People say, just remember Krishna at the time of death and you're all set. That's not what Prabhupada or Krishna is saying. Krishna is saying, remember Krishna at every point, and naturally you'll remember Krishna at the time of death. Does this make sense? I hope I've clarified a misconception if there was one. It's a very popular one, right? Just keep on going and then boom, done. But no, that is not the case. Okay, so I saw the chat go off. Yes, 100%. More, yeah, 100%. Yeah, exactly what Alex said. More kirtan, less cannabis, okay? Okay, can you explain tyajante versus tyajatyante? No, I cannot. Is my quick answer. I'd have to go back to think of the significance of it. Which text is that from, Mridang?
Yam Yam Vapi Smaran Bhavam. Because people say tyajatyante, and then like someone was saying it's actually just tyajante, and you said it that way, so I thought I'd ask you why. Because you read the English and even the Sanskrit, it actually says tyajatyante, but some people just apparently supposed to pronounce it tyajante, but I don't know why that's the case.
I mispronounced it because people do say, maybe it's just a common mispronunciation. It should be pronounced tyajatyante.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, tyajante is a different word. Oh, yeah. So tyajante is a different word. I get what you're asking now. So tyajante is a different word. It's in the passive. So it's technically a different word. Whereas and this is actually two words. So tyajante is one word, whereas tyajatyante is two words. Okay. This is tyajati ante. Yeah, they're just two different words. Anyone who'd say tyajate for this shloka is mispronouncing it. Wouldn't be saying
it. Customer already said it.
Pardon?
Never mind.
Oh, is this? If you've got a further reference, please send it my way. But I've never heard of it being pronounced.
Yeah, I'll send it to you, and I'd love to hear what you think. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely listen to it. Okay, and then there was one question from Alex about back to Godhead. Good point. So I just skimmed through that. So back to Godhead, interestingly enough, didn't refer to individuals. The original context of the original article, so Prabhupada got it from, I think, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury, for those of you who don't know, is in charge of the Anglican churches. It's a bit more complex than that, but for our intents and purposes, he's in charge of the Anglican churches. But he was speaking about society. He was saying society needs to go back home, back to Godhead. So it's interesting because I'm pretty sure Prabhupada himself also uses it in that sense initially. So he says we need to take society and use Krishna consciousness to transform it and turn society back home, back to Godhead. Of course, then it got applied onto the individual level. But yeah, it originally starts as a quote that Prabhupada really liked. And the reason why it says back in the original quote is because the whole idea is that society used to be very godly and now it's not. Something like that. But yeah, no. But definitely back home, back to Godhead, it works, right? Because does the intention matter? Okay, that's a good question, Vishaka. I'll just finish this point and then I'll get to it. Because when we're talking about remembering, what are we talking about? Adhyatma. What is the nature of the soul, right? And the nature of the soul is to serve Krishna. Home is where, and home is where you belong, right? I'm sure we can all put that on a little, print that out and someone's mum will put it up on the wall, right? But home is where you belong, right? So when you're remembering where you belong. You're going back home, you're going where you belong. And that's why it's back home, back to Godhead, in the general sense. But originally it's interesting, it was on a societal level. If you remember Krishna at the time of death, does the intention matter? Yes, because if you're remembering Krishna in a, okay, look, yes and no. To a degree, you have to have the correct conception of Krishna, right? Even Ajamil, right? Even Ajamil, okay, yes, Vignaraj Prabhu's already brought him up. Even Ajamil, our acharyas say, had some correct conception of who Narayan was from his background. He did, actually, it's described that that when he gave, I think it's Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur who says this. Chakravarti Thakur says that when Ajamil gave the name, he gave the name because he had some proper conception of who Narayan is, right? And because he had some proper conception of who Narayan is, when he said the name, there was still a proper conception in his head. He wasn't fully just thinking of his son, right? He was also thinking of how he had said. So there has to be some understanding of the holy name, right? So in that sense, it's not that, let's say somebody, average Joe, right? Let's say there's some girl, right? She falls in love with some Indian guy who's fully secular, just a standard second generation Indian kid, right? And his name is Krishna, right? And at the time of her death, she thinks, oh, Krishna. She won't because she doesn't have any conception of Krishna, right? Okay, even, but Ajamil does, because we all know who Narayan is, we should name our children. Yep, 100%. Name your children Narayan, okay? Or Krishna, yeah. Okay, so, but there does need to be a proper conception there. Again, our acharyas go through long lengths to make this point. Ajamil did have some proper conception. It wasn't just that he was just calling out the name of his son, right?
So technically doesn't, if someone just remembers the name of Krishna, there's no guarantee that they'll go back to Godhead. It's obviously... Oh,
they will if they have like a correct conception of it. But here's the thing, right? So it's the question of karma, right? Karma is that which constructs our material body. Our actions determine the way our bodies act. It's this very weird interplay, right? Where our nature causes us to do things, and our nature is determined by the things we do, right? This is very interesting interplay, right? Between free will and just the nature of ourselves, right? So you will only remember Krishna's name at the time of death if you've done the sort of activities to have that sort of nature. Does that make sense? And intention does matter, but the only way you're really going to remember it, if you have the proper conception, is if you've cultivated that mood. Also, if you remember the spiritual master, you also go back home back to Godhead. Prabhupada said this. If you remember Prabhupada at the time of death, you will also go back home back to Godhead. But yeah, the chat's going off. Let's see if it's questions. Okay, it's not questions. I'll ignore all of the chat right now. So yeah, so does that make sense? So Ajamil's interesting because yeah, Ajamil did have some proper conception going on. Okay.
Sort of, but sorry.
Yeah.
A tangent. We can chat offline.
No, that's all right. I'm happy to take questions.
I like Ajamil. So at the time of death, he obviously remembered Narayan, but then he was given a second chance, isn't that right? And then
Yeah.
when he realized the extent of where he's going to go, then he started to become more serious in Krishna consciousness. But just because he remembered the name Narayan, even with that intention, it didn't mean that it was guaranteed to go back to Godhead. It was only when because of that fear, then he did the practice of going back to Godhead.
Yeah, I mean, even look at Shishupal, right? Shishupal is listing off all of Krishna's qualities, trying to insult Krishna. And Narada Muni glorifies him by saying what a great devotee. He was so absorbed in thoughts of Krishna. So the whole thing's a bit more complex than we want to let on, right? Shishupal does attain perfection by insulting Krishna because he's always thinking about Krishna, right? He's constantly meditating about Krishna, how much he hates Krishna. And then at the end, at the yajna, he's there and he just goes out and he lets out all of the insults and all of the insults that he's insulting Krishna with are glorifications because he's been thinking about Krishna for so long that he's listing all of the qualities of Krishna, and he's sort of like, yeah, and he lists all of these things, and then gets his head gets killed by Krishna, and he attains perfection. And the whole idea is because he was so much meditating about Krishna, right? So intention, in one sense, does matter in terms of where you go in the spiritual world, but it really is the principle of meditation on Krishna in an appropriate way. That's why Hiranyakashipu does not go back home back to Godhead. Because Hiranyakashipu did not realize that Narasimhadev was the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Ravana did not realize Ramchandra was the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But Shishupal did in a very deep way. So yeah, it's more complex. Yeah.
Makes sense, yeah.
So yeah, that perfection does need to be attained. And that's why Ajamil does later go on to achieve them. Do you know how many Vishnu Duttas appeared when he said Narayan? This is just fun facts now. I like to talk about Bhagavatam. I don't get too much. Yeah. Srikanta Sena Prabhu is right. Narayana. One for each syllable. So actually it said even when he said na with that intention, already he had been delivered from the Yamadutas. Jagannath Mishra. Now I'm confused. I'm not sure if that's just banter.
It's banter.
Okay, it's banter. Okay, yeah. Okay, let's keep on going. Good tangent to have, because I do feel like this principle. Ooh, is my screen glitching out? Okay. I feel like it's a good principle to nail down because this is something that gets thrown around in devotee circles all the time, and there's not much clarity or philosophy put behind it. Everyone just goes, just remember Krishna at the time of death, Hari Bol, and then no one really understands what we're talking about, right? So hopefully we've all got a better grasp on that.
Prabhu, and isn't there also on top of that, it said, I think it's Varaha Purana or Gaga, I forgot which one, but even if someone has practiced Krishna conscious their entire life, if at the time of death they do not remember Krishna, then he himself will come into their mind and take them back to Godhead. So actually, the safer bet is actually to perform bhakti.
Well, that's the thing. So when we read it holistically, the point isn't remember Krishna at the time of death. The point is practice Krishna consciousness your whole life, and at the time of death, you'll naturally remember Krishna, right? And even if you don't, you're still chill, right? But the point here isn't, okay, now you're dying, now think about Krishna. The point of this whole section and of all of these passages is always practice Krishna consciousness so you're able to remember Krishna at the time of death. That one poet, the blind one, the blind Vaishnav poet, what's his name? Chandidas, I think.
Bilvamangal?
No, not Bilvamangal. There's another blind one. Right?
Surdas?
Surdas, that's what I'm thinking of. Surdas has this great line where he says, you know, if I would ever be such an unfortunate soul so as to remember my Supreme Lord at the time of my passing, I know that he will never forget me, right? So yeah, that principle is there. So as I'm saying, this whole section is there to encourage us to practice Krishna consciousness now, not later on. But it's describing the mechanism of it, right? Okay, so I think let's keep on going then. So text 7, we already discussed all of that. Interesting note, what does he say? Mam anusmara yudhyacha, right? So he says, anusmara yudhyacha, remember me and then fight. Remembrance of Krishna is central, right? Again, if we're doing, there's nothing bad about doing service and thinking of other things, but the basic principle is actually to remember Krishna, right? So when we do services and everything, whenever we do what we should be doing, the principle is let us remember Krishna and then do them, right? You still get purification if you don't remember Krishna, but if you're really serious about going back home, back to Godhead, try and remember Krishna first. Okay, so we've discussed that. Yeah, let's just keep on going then. Okay, maybe let me ask Mataji, so let's have Alex, would you like to read out the English after I read out the Sanskrit here?
Sure.
Abhyasa yoga yuktena chetasa nanya gamina paramam purusham divyam yati parthanu chintayan.
He who meditates on me as the Supreme Personality of Godhead, his mind constantly engaged in remembering me, undeviated from the path, he, O Partha, is sure to reach me.
Jai. So again, we're having emphasis on this whole point, right? He who meditates on me, right? His mind constantly engaged in remembering me. Again, contextually, we need to understand what that text is saying. It's not saying, don't think about Krishna until you're dying. It's saying, think about Krishna all the time, and then you're remembering when you die. It's the exact same point, right? Because the time of death is when our most strongest impressions come out, right? The strongest impressions we've made on our life come out at those final moments. And so those strong impressions have to come out. And therefore, you are sure to reach Krishna, okay? And now we hear, let's have Vidhi Mataji, would you like to read out the English after I've read out the Sanskrit here? Kavim Puranam Anushashitaram Annoraniyam Sam Manusmaredyaha Sarvasya Dhataram Achintya Rupam Aditya Varnam Tamasa Parastat.
One should meditate upon the Supreme Person as the one who knows everything, as he who is the oldest, who is the controller, who is the smaller than the smallest, who is the maintainer of everything, who is beyond all material conception, who is inconceivable, and who is always a person. He is luminous like the sun, and he is transcendental beyond this material nature.
Yes. So we hear wonderful ways of remembering Krishna at this point, right? So it's really nice when we have this. He is the oldest, he's smaller than the smallest. All of these things, they sound rather interesting. Oh, what's the thing? Most moved mover, yes. They sound rather interesting, right? Also, one thing, just actually, I'll make the point now. He's the oldest. This is interesting, right? Because often when we think of the oldest, right, people will say, you'll see in like churches and all, God is depicted as an old man with a beard, right? And why is this the case? Well, it's because, well, God is the oldest thing, so he should be very old, right? And Bhakti-siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, when he first saw this, he commented upon this. He said that actually, if we take that logic, then even older than an old man is a dead man, right? Because a dead man is even older than an old man, right? Actually, if somebody is the most old, they must be the most young, because that means they can be old, they can last forever, right? If somebody is eternally old, then they must be eternally young, because the moment somebody starts aging, then eventually their dead form is the oldest form. Therefore, we should think that the most old form is the eternally youthful form, not the eternally old form. Does that make sense? In order to be eternally old, one must be eternally young. And so therefore, Krishna is the perfect form of the eternal one, right? Because he's infinitely ever young. Okay, a little side tangent, but I always like that point. Okay, so what we find here, though, is a rather interesting description. And starting from, I would say starting from this text, some people disagree, there's different ways to split it, but starting from this text onto text 13, if you want to put that in your notes, we are going to hear about Yoga Mishra Bhakti. Who can tell me, revision from last week, what is Mishra Bhakti? Well, I'll have a ban on anyone who's already answered a question. Well, I'm gonna do that. Somebody who hasn't answered a question so far, what is Mishra Bhakti? Oh, Shrikanta Sena Prabhu's already beaten me before I could enlist my ban. Okay, then, because we already know it's mixed, who can give me an example? What are some Mishra Bhaktis we were discussing? What is an example?
There's Karma Mishra Bhakti, where you have like some material desire.
Yep. And what's an example of a Karma Mishra Bhakta?
I think we were talking about like Dhruv Maharaj.
Yeah, perfect. So, very good. And then, chat's going off, makes me lol. Yeah, I'm a Bhakti Mishra Karma. I'm a Bhakti Mishra Karmi, really. I'm all for my Karma Kanda, and I might sprinkle in some Bhakti in there every once in a while. Okay. Okay, and then we have, of course, Jnana Mishra Bhakti. But in this section, and we'll wrap up on this section, we hear about the Yoga Mishra Bhakta, right? This is the form of Yoga Mishra Bhakti, right? Because what do we hear here, right? He is the oldest, he is the controller, he is smaller than the most small, right? He is all of these things, while they are true of Krishna, are very much in the mind of the yogi. And we'll see this as we go on. I'll just touch on the English. One who, at the time of death, fixes his life air between the eyebrows, and by the strength of yoga, with an undeviating mind, engages himself in remembering the Supreme Lord in full devotion, will certainly attain to the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Okay? Persons who are learned in the Vedas, who utter Omkar, and who are great sages in the renounced order, enter into Brahman. Desiring such perfection, one practices celibacy. I shall now briefly explain to you this process by which one may attain salvation. On that note, we will wrap up. But Krishna there, he's introducing Yoga Mishra Bhakti. So we've heard about Karma Mishra Bhakti. We've heard about Jnana Mishra Bhakti. Now we're going to hear about Yoga Mishra Bhakti. And that's what we will continue to discuss next week. We'll finish chapter 8 next week because, believe it or not, the rest of the chapter is pretty short. It's just really the beginning part that's very content heavy. So next week we'll finish chapter 8. So in preparation for that, the homework is finish chapter 8, okay? If everyone can finish chapter 8 in the build up to next week, I will be very happy. Okay, are there any questions before we resume? Okay, good news. I've finally marked all of your open book essays from all that time ago. But I'll take a while to I'll still take a tiny bit longer to get the marks back to you because I just need to remark them to make sure I've marked everyone at the same level of, at the same standards. But just so you all know, there is progress being made. You will get your results back before you get the next open book questions.
Prabhuji, when is the next exam?
The next exam will be at the end of this unit. I'm still not sure exactly how long we're going to be. We're at chapter 8 now. Chapter 8 is quick. Chapters 9 and look, I'm going to give us at least another 3 months.
June, July, August.
Yeah.
Okay.
When do you think would be the open assessment?
The open book, I'm going to ask you the questions later on because I'm thinking of doing ones which we need to have a better grasp of the later chapters for. So,
Right.
so this, and also because this module is short, I feel like module 2 is a relatively short module. Because this is a shorter module, it'll be more clumped, it'll be more all together. All the assessments are going to be way more clumped up. It's going to be a hint more stressful in that sense than module 1 was. Just because we won't be spending 3 months doing chapter 2, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay.
Does that make sense? So yeah, but within, definitely you've more than a month before I even give you the questions. But after, once the open book has been submitted, it'll probably be only like a few weeks before we do the closed book. Okay, Prabhuji just admitted that he's bell curving. No, I'm not bell curving the results. I'm just making sure I've marked everyone equally. Everyone passed, so don't worry. Nobody's going to have to reset. Especially the people who I bell curved the results of. Pass, not joking. Everyone did pass. Everyone passed on the raw mark. I'm just making, because what always happens is at the beginning, you're really strict with marking. You're making sure every single, and by the end, you just want to get it over and done with, and you just give the marks away quickly. So I'm just going to redo it just to make sure that I haven't, unfairly given somebody lower or higher marks. Okay. If that's that, I think we'll wrap up. Yep, I'll see you all next week. We'll finish chapter 8 then. And yeah, Hare Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki jai.
Vaishnavebhyo namaha.
Thank you, Prabhu.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Hare
Thank you,
Krishna.
Prabhuji.
Thank you so much, Prabhuji. Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Hare